So I'm going to try and give you a kind of overview of basically a common pattern that we see in kind of blockchain solutions to things. So I'm going to call out two examples, and I'm going to then talk about a potential third. By way of introduction, I'm Rob Knight. I'm co-founder of Mattereum. We work on enforceability and automation of legal contracts using smart contract technology. And we also handle dispute resolution for blockchain smart contracts. So I don't think anybody else has done this yet. And I appreciate that for this audience, this is probably unnecessary, so I'm going to go super quickly through this bit. But as a baseline set of assumptions about what a blockchain is, there are many, many definitions, and there are many disputes about what counts as a real blockchain. I would say it counts as a blockchain if it has most of these things. Immutable history, so once you put something on a blockchain, it stays there. Digital signatures built in so that we can figure out that transactions are valid and were validly signed by the owner of a private key. Some fair solution to consensus, either proof of work or permission systems, but the notion at least that there is no single central node that is running the overall system. Some notion of smart contracts, or at least some kind of programmability. Even Bitcoin has some kind of programmability built in, and other systems have much more advanced smart contract tech. And probably Merkle trees are in there somewhere. And there's a whole bunch of systems that can kind of meet the definition of a blockchain if we have this kind of loose notion of what one is. And the way that I normally explain this to people who've never heard of a blockchain before is to talk about there being kind of three great ages of the internet. The first thing starts in about 1973, and you get a bunch of scientists and academics and researchers using the first ARPANET. And there's no encryption, everything is in the clear, and it's really all about just sharing ideas, sharing information. So they build the tools that they need to get that job done. They build email, they build news groups, and right at the end of this process, one of the scientists who's using the internet at the time invents the World Wide Web. And as a result of inventing the World Wide Web, the scientists lose control of the internet. Because it turns out that the World Wide Web is so popular and so easy to use that regular people want to use it, and this brings commercial activity onto the internet for pretty much the first time. So we get the second age of the internet, which is a commercial internet. It's the internet of shopping and of e-commerce. We get the web, which has this neat kind of browsing metaphor, which is kind of similar to what you do if you're in a store. You know, you browse around, you look, you see what's on the shelves, you see what's in stock, you see what the price is, you see if you like it, you put it in a basket, you take it to the checkout, and then you pay for it, and now you own it. That's exactly what you do in a store, and that's also exactly what you do on an e-commerce site. So the fit between the technology and the main behavior that people wanted to enable is very, very good. Off the back of this, we get three of the world's 5 largest companies by market cap, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Amazon exists to sell people things in exactly the way I just described, and Google and Facebook exist to advertise those things to people who might want to buy them. We also get Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, eBay, and a whole bunch of other companies that everybody knows. But they're all doing the same thing. They're basically riding on the fact that we have just enough cryptography that you can send your credit card number securely over the internet and buy stuff with it. That's it. And that gives us a 20-year massive tech boom. Really, really simple. Off just this handful of tiny technology, a massive 20-year tech boom. What doesn't get touched during that time is personal finance or much to do with business-to-business commerce. If you want a loan or an insurance contract, it works pretty much the same way it did in the 90s. And if you're in business and you want to invoice one of your customers, that works pretty much the same way it did in the 90s as well. We might be doing those things on computers, but if you're attaching a PDF to an email, you might as well be sending a fax. So we haven't meaningfully digitized anything to do with personal finance or anything to do with business-to-business commerce in the way that we have digitized consumer retail. Because it turns out that this is just a differently shaped problem. The web is great for this browsing around and buying stuff, but it's not so great for, I sign a contract and then sometime later, after an undefined period has elapsed, I might then want to activate the terms of the contract, which is how things work for insurance. It doesn't work very well for things that are multi-party arrangements. The relationship is always the client-server relationship. There's always the one person with their web browser, and then there's the web server that they're interacting with. It's fundamentally one-to-one. It's not very good at variable outcomes. So if you think about a loan, the interest rate may vary over the course of a loan. Well, generally speaking, the price of things that you pay for with your credit card doesn't vary during the process of buying it. It can happen, but it doesn't happen very often. So to model the rest of the world's economy, we need something that gives us this ability to sign contracts with some notion of identity. Well, digital signatures give us something that can work towards that direction. We need those things to stay there once we've signed them and not disappear the way things do on the web. So our immutable storage turns out to be really useful. And we need to be able to model variable outcomes, such as interest rates change and now the payments need to be a little bit higher, or a payment was missed and now there's a penalty charge. But it turns out that smart contracts are really good for that kind of thing. So the reason why people think that the blockchain might be a thing at all is that we finally have a set of technologies that are a good fit for solving all the problems we couldn't solve using the web. Now, on top of this, we then built this horrible kind of pseudo-gambling industry and there's this massive kind of wave of hype. But the fundamental principle that there's something here and it might be useful genuinely stands up. So I'm using that as my assumption of what blockchains are and what blockchains can do. And that's my general notion of the set of capabilities that we have and what we might be able to do with them. So Taylor took us through the whole notion of Coase's theory of the firm and transaction costs. So I'm going to go reasonably quickly through this bit. Basically, I'm in complete agreement with everything that Taylor said. What Coase's theory of the firm gives us is an explanation for why we don't have everybody just trading individually on their own. The reason why we have jobs and employment and firms is that it's very, very difficult to coordinate a bunch of free agents who are just doing their own thing based on their own intrinsic motivations. You need some kind of top-down hierarchy, some kind of shared notion of mission and purpose if you want to get a group of humans to collaborate with each other. So we can reduce our transaction costs, the costs of negotiating with each other and the costs of handling any disputes by just accepting that someone is in charge and they're going to give us orders and we're all going to kind of go along with that shared activity. We can break these integrated firms up and create new markets, but those new markets definitely bring higher transaction costs with them. I had to include this, because this is the thing that first got me interested in Ribbon Farm, which is obviously the hierarchy of sociopaths, clueless, and losers. And this is ultimately how firms work. The shared intent is formed top-down. The leaders give instructions. People below them need to figure out and interpret those instructions to the best of their ability or inability. And then at the bottom of the pyramid, there are some people whose job is to allegedly actually do these things or pretend to do them. And disputes in that kind of situation are a disciplinary matter. If you don't like what your boss is telling you to do, your option is to kind of quit or be an insubordinate in some way. You can't really renegotiate with your boss in most circumstances. In a market, or at least in a fair market where there aren't major imbalances of power between the participants, everything is a negotiation. You form shared intent by negotiating a contract, and that contract should be one that is acceptable to both parties. Doesn't always work like that, but that's the ideal. And disputes are handled by neutral procedures that are enforced by third parties. So if you have a contractual dispute, you would take that to a mediator or an arbitrator, or ultimately you might take it to court. But there is no sense that there's a hierarchical imbalance between the parties to the contract, as there is with a dispute with an employer. And it turns out that if we don't like this kind of top-down hierarchy approach, there is the alternative of let's marketize everything. But this turns out to be really, really, really difficult to do. So in the areas of the economy where we have basically marketized everything, it's turned out not to work as well as we might expect. The F-35 has a giant constellation of many, many different private contractors who are all involved in producing different parts of the project, spread across multiple different countries. and it's late and over budget. The British railway networks were privatized in the 1990s, and although they run better than they did then in some ways, this is mostly because they're still heavily subsidized by the government, and the privatization hasn't meaningfully led to better customer service or greater passenger satisfaction. The US healthcare system is a myriad of private suppliers, all doing different jobs. In theory, this should be perfectly competitive and should give us the optimal outcome, but in practice it doesn't. You get about the same health outcomes as you do in Europe, but for some considerable multiple of the cost. Modern universities are also going down this same path, so rather than being united by a common purpose around the delivery of education or the performance of research, they now have targets and goals and market-based objectives to increase the average salary of a graduate by a certain amount or whatever it might be, and the whole thing runs off debt. Arguably, the global financial crisis also has this same problem. Rather than single institutions that issue loans to people and also hold the risk, that risk then gets parceled up and handed off in different contracts to different organizations, and the result is a loss of context. What we have is all of these contracts being signed, where by the time the last person in the chain signs the contract in which they take on the risk, they've got very tenuous, if any, connection back to the original person who issued the debt. There's no real understanding of what's going on, so there's this attenuation of knowledge throughout the network. So often these things just don't work as well as we think they should. So if you want to think about how markets should work, if you want an idealized, perfected view of how they should work, you start with someone like Friedrich Hayek. And to be fair, I actually think Hayek gets a lot of things right about how markets are meant to work. It's just that in practice they don't meet the kind of very, I don't know, the utopian vision that is sometimes set out. What we can get out of smart contracts, however, is that we begin to digitize the relationships between the participants in our trading networks. We can see, we have records of exactly what was traded from whom to whom, what the handoffs were, and this gives us a namespace that we can explore these contracts in. It means we can attach metadata to contracts. It means that we have a natural point around which information can begin to form. In the same way that a hyperlink allows people to form their own set of references to a web page and say what they think about it, the idea that you have transactions on a blockchain that have a unique global identifier means that people can kind of add their own metadata to those transactions and explain what they do. So we begin to get, instead of this kind of loss of information every time a piece of value is handed on inside a network, we could get an increase in the amount of information every time a piece of value is handed on through a network. My co-founder, Vinay Gupta, who I think some of you probably know, wrote a paper about this a couple of years ago called Dog Atheism, in which he speculated on the idea that instead of simply reducing all payments to money, we would begin to see with smart contracts complex value exchanges where we exchange equity, or we exchange rights over things, or we exchange carbon credits, just as easily as we exchange money. We kind of see this already in some startup ecosystems where people are paid in equity for doing a job. We could see that kind of thing extend much more, and that begins to get these kind of richer information flows going through an economy. So what we have in this first example is a situation where everyone is kind of bound together in a common framework inside a firm, and there is a desire to disaggregate that firm, to break it up, and enable those people to kind of trade with each other on a more egalitarian basis. This is difficult because it introduces new transaction costs, and it's difficult because it's hard to get the information to flow correctly between all of those participants. It turns out that this problem occurs in other domains as well. In particular, it occurs in relation to globalization. So what we have here is Danny Roderick's trilemma of the world economy. Danny Roderick is a Harvard professor, foremost authority on trade policy. And several years ago, I think over a decade ago, he posed this question, or he posed this trilemma to the world. It seems that there are three things that we want. We want democracy, we want nation states, and we want integrated markets. We want to be able to trade with anybody anywhere else in the world. And these three things seem pretty unarguable. People definitely like their nation states. To the extent that they think about nation states at all, they tend to want more of them rather than fewer. Separatist movements are an example of creating new nation states. People generally seem to like democracy. Produces some strange results sometimes, but we like it. And at the very least, we like the idea of self-determination, that we get to do things our way. Even a dictatorial leader will justify their position by saying, I'm standing up for our way of doing things against the rest of the world. So self-determination might be a more general way of putting this. And we want integrated markets. We like being able to buy stuff from other places in the world. We like having access to different sources of food and music and culture. We like the fact that materials can be cheaper if they're bought from certain locations. And we ultimately are all using computers and smartphones and whatnot that are constructed halfway around the world. So Roderick argues that it's actually quite difficult to have all three of these things at the same time. If you have, for instance, national sovereignty and globalization by diminishing democracy, you get something that looks a little bit like the trade treaties that have been negotiated over the last 20 years. People argue that NAFTA is kind of somewhat undemocratic. The TPP treaty was struggling largely because it was perceived as undemocratic. You can get globalization and democracy if you're willing to diminish the nation state. So the European Union, for instance, has a European Parliament, and it has some of the machinery of a democratic system, but it does this at the cost of reducing the independence of its constituent members. Or you could have democratic politics and national sovereignty, but at that point, you have many, many boundaries between these individual nation states, and they're all self-determining, they're all going off and doing their own thing, and this makes the kind of coordinated whole difficult to achieve. This is actually pretty similar to the Coasean situation, where if you have everybody being individual and self-determining, it's really, really hard to get coordination. The way we've done things over the last kind of 40 to 50 years has been the era of globalization. People have kind of been told that democratic self-determination is great and all that, but we really, really need the trade. We really, really need to be forming ourselves into these larger and larger collective organizations through treaties. So we either have to eliminate the self-determination, the right of nations to make their own rules, or eliminate the nations altogether. So the EU takes the approach of diminishing the role of the nation state. Something like the World Trade Organization takes the approach of saying, well, you can keep your nation states as long as they never make any rules that disagree with the World Trade Organization. And the result is basically large, homogeneous global trading blocks with reduced local variety. There is less variety in local regulation than there used to be. But this was extremely useful at the time because the cost of managing all of this local variation in rules was regarded as extremely difficult. The amount of paperwork you would need to have just to move something through a supply chain that went through 7 different national boundaries would be enormous. We now see a massive growth in complex supply chains inside the European Union that would never have been possible prior to the European Union existing. Because, quite simply, you would have had 3-hour delays at every single border while you wait for the man in the office to stamp your paperwork, and then you take it through, and then you wait for the next man in the office to stamp the paperwork, and so on and so forth. It was a very practical, very, very simple problem. And we solved it by eliminating most of the border checks by having the rules be the same throughout the whole of Europe. But this is beginning to break down. Roderick's trilemma pointed this out over a decade ago, but we're now seeing the practical implications. So the TPP treaty failed to achieve ratification. NAFTA is apparently now up for renegotiation, according to Donald Trump. Brexit actually happened. Which surprised me. Right-wing populism and nationalism is on the rise. I think there was a quote from the Prime Minister of Hungary today saying that the era of liberal democracy is over. And this is apparently a legitimate thing for a political leader to say, which nobody would have predicted a decade ago. And we also now know that the China shock to the world economy was actually real. The story that everybody's been saying that, all these Rust Belt state people kind of losing their jobs was mostly due to automation. No, it was because the people in China were making the same stuff for cheaper. We kind of know that happened now. So this is leading to pushback against the idea of globalization, the idea that we can just have one set of rules for the entire world and it's one kind of free-flowing competitive market is beginning to break down. So if we were going to redo the system from here, how might we do it in a world where we have a blockchain? Well, boundaries aren't really that much of a problem. Boundaries are fine. We need to be able to put some boundaries around things. Variation between regulations in different places actually sounds like a really good thing. Let's try out having a law in one place where we ban smoking. Let's try out having a law in another place where we allow genetic modification of humans. Let's have another law in regulation in some other place where we allow flying drone taxis that we wouldn't allow everywhere else. This kind of variation seems like a good thing. So that suggests that our only problem is the integration of trade in a world where everybody has different laws. Well, this brings us back to our friend the smart contract. If we've digitized all of these contractual relationships, we can work out what the compliance implications are. So a smart contract between two parties to perform some kind of trade, if it's a digital thing, if it can be analyzed by software, we can work out, okay, what regulations apply to this? Okay, you're shipping beef from Argentina to South Africa. What are the food labeling requirements in South Africa? Okay, well now we don't want to ship it to South Africa anymore, we want to ship it to France. Okay, well what are the food labeling requirements in France? Those kinds of things are quite difficult for humans to deal with, but they're very, very easy for computers to deal with. The European Union has taken the approach of making one set of regulations for basically an entire continent, because you have 28 members, and if they tried to do that through a set of bilateral agreements between all of them, that would be 378 separate bilateral agreements. But for a computer, 378 agreements is no more difficult than handling one. You just have a loop. Like we have the technology for this. So we do get the ability to begin to allow the divergences in the same way that smart contracts might allow freely contracting individual entities or smaller entities to function in the market. We might allow smaller units of lawmaking, smaller units of regulation to operate in the world and still be able to collaborate with each other. So if we go back to the trilemma, we can kind of generalize this by saying national sovereignty is really just about separation. Democratic politics is really just about self-determination, and globalization is really just about integration. So any situation where you have separate units that determine their own course of action, but you need them to integrate into a global whole, you're going to face something like this kind of trilemma. But we do have the possibility of using computers to handle an awful lot of those coordination problems, and blockchains give us the kind of the framework on which we could do this. So what we end up with then is this kind of new archipelago. We end up with people forming their own new units, their fantasy worlds, their fantasy countries, because this isn't limited just to firms and nation states. This could be Reddit communities. This could be any group where you want to have rules that exist within one place, where you want to be able to move things from one place to another, and where you want to have some kind of dispute resolution to handle the cases where one of those groups thinks that something's gone wrong. Think about cultural appropriation. Think about a meme that originates on one particular subreddit, and they don't want it appropriated by some other subreddit. You could have rules for any meme that's generated in this subreddit, cannot be posted on any other subreddit, as long as there is some kind of dispute resolution framework in which that thing can be settled. So you end up with this. Potentially, if this pattern recurs, you can end up with a situation where what the blockchain has done is it's lowered the cost of making and enforcing rules, and that allows us to have many, many more kind of mini societies with their own rules, but still with an ability to coordinate with each other. So this is one possible future. This is one possible thing that you could use blockchains for. And it's one solution to the Coasean firm problem. It's one solution to the problems of the trilemma of globalization. It's not the only solution. There are other ways we could solve it. More restrictive nationalisms, autarky, a kind of situation where every nation retreats into its own local reality. We could have a balkanized internet. The Great Firewall of China is an example of that already, but we could begin to break these things up and have them not talk to each other. Or we could have a global monoculture. We just agree that there's going to be one set of rules, and that's going to work for everybody, and we're going to enforce that through some kind of top-down authority, possibly the United Nations, probably not, but some kind of top-down authority. So there are many different ways that this could be done. What we've done at Mattereum is we've created a scenario planning pack. So we basically generated 7 different scenarios for how we think the future is going to go or might go, specifically with relation to blockchain technology. And so what I've just kind of described is kind of like the syndicate model. You have these different groups that break up and make their own rules and do their own thing internally, but they're still capable of trading with each other. But each of those other scenarios is kind of like the numbers there are in relation to a specific project, not in relation to how likely we think those things are actually going to be. And we've used these scenarios to evaluate a bunch of different blockchain projects over time, and we continue to kind of keep that kind of thing up to date. So I'm not suggesting that what I've just described is definitely what's going to happen. I'm just suggesting that it's one possible future that gets enabled by blockchain technology. And that's it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
Could you just move the mic up a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. So I spent some time in high-frequency trading, where what I took away from that was that in the early 90s, others and Fidelity created a language to say yes or no to each other really quickly.
Right.
That was the FIX protocol, or the Financial Information Exchange Protocol. And since then, the outcomes of computerized trading have been less about preserving markets and more about volume trading, right? And although the transaction costs of retail investors has reduced like exponentially, but it's interesting that first event, in my head at least, that seminal event was 2 large centralized bodies agreeing to develop a language to say yes and no to each other really quickly.
Yeah.
And is Mattereum kind of a general purpose framework for other kind of institutions or any entities to basically exchange rules with each other as opposed to exchanging records?
So, I think what's really interesting there is, as you say, these things don't necessarily come from the bottom up. They can come from large entities, negotiating with each other and building those protocols that way. What we do, that kind of thing happens all the time. That like large organizations make these kinds of framework agreements with each other all the time. What we get at least out of public blockchains is a sense that those things are open to everybody. So once a protocol has been established, anyone can use it. And this is the basic assumption behind the internet. Once you define TCP/IP, anyone can connect to the internet and anyone can use TCP/IP. A private protocol that can only be used between those 2 original entities is the kind of private blockchain sort of scenario. So it will vary from place to place. It will depend. To actually do that kind of stuff on the public blockchains that we have at the moment would be basically impossible. They don't scale. But as a vision for where we want to get to in the future, definitely those public open protocols are very important. But to do that, you have a bunch of prerequisites. You need to know the identity of the participants in many cases if you ever want to resolve a dispute. So, a number of the kind of key assumptions behind the current generation of blockchain tech don't really support doing that for real value in the real world. What we do is use identity and use legal contracts to govern those relationships, and that gives you a formal, legally enforceable dispute resolution system that is, has the same power as a court order. So, it can be done, but it requires relaxing some of our assumptions about anonymity or so on and so forth in some cases.
Thank you as well. So in California and the Western United States, there's growing momentum towards what's being called sort of a Internet of Water. And I could see this kind of concept of Internet of Agreements being used for like water markets, trading water rights, what have you. One of the key challenges, though, is that there's a lot of interest vested in the kind of current opaque, murky situation. And I would, like in game theoretic terms, I could see it as sort of like a stag hunt, where like, this kind of rosy, having a God's eye view of things, maybe like there's better for everyone involved, but there's a lot of incentives to sort of not choose that for current interests. So I was kind of curious to your thoughts about how, I think there's probably more examples of this across industries where there's a lot of vested interests who don't want like a God's eye view of all their transactions. We're perfectly happy the way that things are. How do you see that kind of transitioning?
I mean, I think if you take the view that there are better forms of organization available to us than the ones we're using now, then eventually on a long enough timeline, eventually those better forms of organization get a chance to operate. So if you look at the banking system is very opaque, it's very confusing, it doesn't produce great results, and it's been visibly broken for the last decade. Like it really doesn't work. It's pretty terrible. And we now have a situation, certainly back in the UK, several of the largest banks are still reliant on government funding. Some of them are substantially owned by the government. That system is on life support, and so if you had a more, an open, more transparent, better organized system for handling the functionality that the banks handle, it wouldn't actually take that much to push the existing banks towards changing. And what they would probably do in that case is change themselves rather than resist and potentially lose out. So it will vary from situation to situation. I just don't know the water situation at all. But if the current system is not performing well, then you have to look for how do you apply pressure to that system to force it into crisis. And at the point that it's in crisis, then you have an opportunity to reform the thing. And a crisis would be extended drought, et cetera, et cetera. And those things will come, and you've got to be sitting there ready with a plan for how we're going to reform this system. If you look throughout the 20th century, many of the major political changes that were made were a result of somebody, writing down a plan, sitting on it for 20 years and waiting for the crisis to happen, at which point they turn up with, I've got the plan to solve this. And at that point, away you go. So these things look kind of hopeless until they don't. At the point that the crisis happens, then you have the opportunity to change.
Just a quick corollary on that, and then an additional comment. First, on the disruption aspect, the innovator's dilemma covers that in a corporate context very well, but it applies more broadly as well, which is that, yeah, you're going to have this thing and it looks like nothing until it becomes something, at which point either it takes over the host organism or the host decides to adopt it out of self-preservation. The other corollary to that is, you are increasing legibility, and there are going to be losses with that because you're just going to make some blunt cuts, and you're going to define things very clearly, and you're going to lose some of the gradient spectrum that you previously had, and that's part of that process. In Ada Palmer's book, Too Like the Lightning, there's a really interesting dynamic there where they have hyper-national transport, where you're having lunch in one country and dinner in another, and this becomes a routine thing, and the velocity and regularity of this transport becomes a driver for having this kind of law system. And so in the book, they arrive someplace for dinner. When they arrive, their transport vehicle saying, hey, here's the diff from where you were to like the local laws. Like these are the ones you really need to know of that are different. And that's something I was thinking about because, I drive around in US and Canada, and there's different laws for how you maintain your vehicle, or like what how you respond to certain things, and you have no idea what those are until you get pulled over, and you're like, oh
Yeah,
shit.
and we're going to need to digitize those things because pretty soon the vehicles will need to know that for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I feel like that's an interesting thing where follow those high velocity cross-border interactions, and as those increase, that's where the change is really going to start.
Yeah.
So you talked earlier about how the corporation and sort of the firm is, and how it can negotiate. You talked about transaction costs, but you didn't seem to talk about anything about market power. Do you think these kind of smart contracts would reduce market power, or? 'Cause, I mean, if you have a monopoly, it doesn't really matter how you negotiate with it. It's going to have all the power in the situation.
So, I honestly don't know the answer to that one. I mean, predicting the future configuration of a market economy is kind of difficult. I wouldn't have guessed that we would have as many, the handful of very, very dominant internet companies that we have now. I would not have seen that coming 10 years ago, or certainly 20 years ago. So I'd be very wary of making some optimistic prediction that, yeah, of course there's going to be all these countervailing powers and they're going to sort all of these things out, and the crowd will do something. That was the great bet from the past. The wisdom of the crowd would solve all of these problems. Yeah, it's going to be, I don't know. We're just going to have to keep watching and figure out what happens. I really don't know how market power would end up being distributed in that kind of situation.
So, in the physical world, right, up until, maybe now, you're seeing like vertical kind of, the city sort of submitting to the county, which submits to the state, which submits to the country, and when you're talking about the types of rules that different organizations, and it could be a subreddit, it could be, us right here, do you see in the future that kind of vertical submission taking place, or is it going to be much more horizontal where, anyone can really decide anything? And
I mean, those things always come down to power in the end. So you can maintain your own rules as long as you have enough power to defend yourself from someone who would like you to follow different rules. The hierarchical kind of nation down to municipal level kind of structure is a kind of compromise because it allows rule setting at different levels. That kind of falls fairly naturally out of the geography. We don't really have that quite the same way on something like the web, where
there's no need for it.
Arguably you do in the sense that you can subdivide a site like Reddit into various subreddits, and you might say there's the overall lore of Reddit, and then there's the lore of the individual subreddits, and maybe you end up with the lore of any thread that was started by this guy because he has his own rules for how people reply to him. But generally speaking, the internet is just much flatter, and you don't have the geographical contestability of space.
Do you think that humans are just fundamentally attracted to that? Like you were saying, you wouldn't expect these few companies, these handful of companies, to really turn into what they are. And I'm just wondering, even with open protocols and decentralization, do people just naturally flock towards things that are sort of similar and rules that they understand and that they don't have to, like, I get what you're saying about how computers and machines.
You get the. There is basically a psychological effect where people want to know the same things that other people know. So the reason why we gossip about celebrities is because the chances are that even if you don't listen to their music or you don't care about any of the movies that they've been in, you know who they are and you can gossip about the same celebrity with someone else. And that basic effect tends to pull people into larger agglomerations, and that pulls people onto platforms like Facebook because you want to have a thread with X number of other people included in it. Well, they all need to be on Facebook for that to happen. So there are a number of situations where it just makes sense for everyone to be on the same platform. The interesting, the interesting question for me is the balance between separation and integration. So we've had that in the past where people have tried to create federated social networks where you have these separate, divided units that can then collaborate over a shared protocol. It hasn't worked super well for everything. It works very well for some things, but it hasn't worked super well overall. What we're seeing, I think, now is a drive towards, because what we're doing now is taking a lot of governance from the real world and putting it online. What we're getting is basically an injection of an awful lot of know-how about how to do that kind of governance from the real world into the tech community. Like the tech community basically had nothing in the 1990s, a bit of libertarian philosophy, and that was kind of it. What we're now getting is governments, nation states getting involved. If you go to crypto conferences around the world, you'll see nation states, state-level actors getting very heavily involved in these things. So the conversation you have in Dubai is very different from the conversation you have in Singapore, which is very different from the conversation that you have in New York, which is very different from the conversation that you have, in any other place, because we're getting this kind of, injection of expertise in governance. So I think it's quite possible that we, things that the tech community couldn't make work on its own in terms of governance might actually become possible, because now tech and governance are kind of becoming the same thing. If you're studying
and finance.
And finance, yeah.
Sort of merging.
So lawyers are learning about this stuff. Political scientists are learning about this stuff. They're becoming digital native. Partly this transforms their profession, but as those people become part of the committee that shapes the future of the internet, as it were, or the future of technology, they begin to shape that stuff as well.
So you hit on one of the major differences between consumer commerce on the internet and B2B commerce on the internet is that consumer commerce is often a spot transaction that happens, there's no relationship after. And so in a B2B contractual relationship, there's often some kind of specific performance that has to happen afterwards, and that often happens in the real world. So what do you see as the most likely way to kind of reliably get information from the real world into the smart contract, or how do you solve the Oracle problem?
That really depends on a case-by-case basis. So you could see use cases for IoT devices. So a project that a friend of mine is involved with is doing employee work tracking. So basically, you clock on just by turning up. And as long as you're within range of the Bluetooth beacon, you can prove that you were at work. So you have provable hours. You don't need to. There's no possibility of timesheet fraud. There's no possibility that you could be denied your pay for having turned up. So that's an example of using IoT. One of my favorite examples of this is a company called Mattereum, which does laser spectroscopy. So they basically you fire a laser at an object, it abrades the top surface of the object, and you can then look at the pattern of photons that are created, and it will give you the unique fingerprint of that kind of material. So you can tell, using this technology, which mine a diamond came from, to within a range of about 200 meters. You can tell if something is actually a banana, or if it's a piece of plastic that looks like a banana. So you can do a whole bunch of this kind of spot checking of the smart contract says that this is a shipment of rice. Is this actually rice, or is this like plastic beads that look like rice? And that, there'll be hundreds of integration points for these kinds of things, some of which will apply automatically and some of which will require effort. A simple one would be a tenancy contract, just logging the interactions between the tenant and the landlord. When was that fault reported? When did you actually do that? When did that damage occur? When was that photograph taken? Would solve a whole bunch of tenant and landlord disputes. So it kind of really varies on the nature of the contract that you're looking at.
I haven't fully thought this question out, but I just wanted to get your thoughts. The idea of smart contracts being used to bring back legitimacy to democracy. So if we all work together to use smart contracts to have our government kind of have an SLA with us, do you see that as a possibility to bring credibility back into voting and the way we hold our governments responsible.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean, like the democracy is one of the most like the current way we do democracy is one of the most technologically outdated things in our society.
Yeah.
Like the 4-year electoral cycle comes from an era when the fastest way of getting information from one place to another was a man on a horse. Like that, the assumption that that getting people's opinions on things is this time intensive, very difficult, expensive thing. That was true 300 years ago. It's not true now. Everybody's carrying around smartphones. If you wanted to know what the public really, really thinks about something and have a vote on it, you could push that vote to everyone's smartphones and have half the country give their answer within a couple of hours. So I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily the way you would want to do it, but the technological capability to do it is certainly there. What's interesting is that none of those capabilities have been taken up. I mean, to the extent that we think that democracy is not performing as well as it could do, and our political system is not as responsive to our desires as we might like, we could start by asking the question, why are we stuck with this kind of 300-year-old technology for conducting democracy? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
That's great. That's very interesting talk. If I'm going to try to throw a curveball, like the one issue I've always, and it's kind of already been raised, is the issue of power. And the one issue I've always had with the Coase theory of the firm is that it tries to make out that firms are these sort of rational results of economic actors who have worked out that it's more efficient to internalize costs within a firm. So it puts it within this whole kind of rational framework. But if you ever look at actually who historically has ended up working in firms, it's people who used to be serfs, it's people who used to be slaves. It was basically marginalized people are the ones who always have to be the ones who end up working. I'm from South Africa. I mean, there's a reason why, for example, all the farm workers and all the mine workers are black people. All right? So there's giant political power issues about who ends up actually in these firms. So I guess how would you integrate this kind of analysis of global power into these type of contracts?
So, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, in the feudal situation, you would have lords and serfs, and there was no contract, in fact, in those days between the lords and the serf. There was a set of what were regarded as duties and obligations, and the lords obviously were noble individuals. They had duties to protect these poor individuals who lived on their land, and the serfs, had obligations to their lord in return, and that was how that system was justified. It was justified as a set of duties and obligations. But it would have made no sense. It might even have been regarded as offensive to think of those parties signing contracts with each other for this stuff. This would suggest that they were equals and capable of negotiating, and they weren't. And so to pretend now that people who are very unequal can just negotiate a contract with each other where both parties have free choice, that is, that to me is not realistic. I agree. I mean, I don't have a good answer. I mean, it's one of those things where if you say, it would be very easy for me to say, that problem is outside of my domain. I can describe this technical stuff, and the power relations of the humans who actually interact with all of it is just beyond my scope. I can give you a couple of kind of fairly crappy neoliberal kind of suggestions for how to fix it, because those are easy to think of. I mean, one would be that smart contracts, when they're digital objects, become easy to compare with each other. So when you fully digitize the contracts, they become much more open to scrutiny. You can compare your contract with somebody else's. I very strongly suspect that we will end up with a kind of kite markings sort of solution for smart contracts. So, this contract is agreed as being a fair contract by, somebody that has set itself up to evaluate those things. We've seen that a little bit with, around personal data, where some companies will say, we have a fair contract to handle your personal data. The Consumer Commons organization does some work on this. So you could imagine, maybe if you imagine you'd need a powerful body, like for instance a labor union, to get behind something like this. But you could imagine a situation where contracts begin to be reviewed for their fairness, and when everybody is using those contracts in common, it's worth doing that kind of analysis in a way that it isn't worth doing that kind of analysis at the moment, because you can't really reuse the analysis of one contract to the next. So there are ways that you might be able to tilt the balance. I'm very much more on this. I'm much better at the kind of incremental tilting the balance stuff than I am on the revolutionary change stuff. But yeah, that's about the best answer I've got.
In the material world, like selling airplanes, fixing potholes, conserving water, whatever. Are there examples of Mattereum actually actively enforcing these blockchain contracts in the physical space?
We've done a few. I wouldn't say that we've done a large number of them. One of the things we do have is an app which is it's very much a developer's tech preview rather than something that you would actually want to use. But it is an app that's in the Google Play Store and in the iOS App Store called EtherCam. And it's really, really simple, really, really dumb. You can take a photograph. You can then set a price that you'd be willing to sell an intellectual property license to that photograph for. And then other people can find your photograph and sign that contract with you and buy a legally enforceable IP license. It's a very, it was the simplest thing that we could think of that would just work in the context of a simple app. But it's fully enforceable. We actually held a test. We held a conference in London last year, and we ran a test arbitration. We had some people, get into a dispute with each other over the license, and then we had a proper arbitration with lawyers on both sides arguing the case. And it turned out that damages were awarded, but they all ended up going to the lawyers as fees, which is how these things normally go. And we've done a few other things, some of which unfortunately I can't talk about, but we have worked with, we're doing an interesting project around purchase of or car finance using smart contracts, which we'll be able to announce a little bit more about soon. That's in collaboration with one of our partners. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of these things in the pipeline, and we hopefully we'll be able to announce more of them soon.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Right. Thank you.